we get so excited, pick me, without giving ourselves the credit or feeling the confidence to know I may have zinged with that person on the bus and we may have had a great conversation, but it turns out they're kind of toxic.
Are you overwhelmed by motherhood and barely keeping your head above water? Are you confused and frustrated by how all the other moms make it look so easy? You can't figure out how to manage the chaos in your mind, your home, or your family. I get you, mama. Parenting with ADHD is hard. Here is your permission slip to let go of the Pinterest-worthy visions of organization and structure fit for everyone else. Let's do life like our brains do life. Creatively, lovingly, and with all our might. When we embrace who we are and how our brains work, we can figure out how to live our lives successfully and, in turn, lead our families well. At the end of the day, we just want to be good moms. But, spoiler alert, you are already a great mom. ADHD does not mean you're doomed to be a hot mess, mama. You can rewrite your story from shame spiral to success story. And I'll be right here beside you to cheer you on. Welcome to Motherhood in ADHD. Hey there, successful mama. Today we're talking about friendship. Specifically, how do we deal with friendship struggles when we have ADHD? And how do we talk about it with our kids? Today I am interviewing Caroline Maguire, who is the author of Why Will No One Play With Me? It is a handbook on how to communicate social skills trainings with your kids and honestly, to ourselves too. Caroline has a background in social skills development. She has developed multiple training methodologies on how do we develop our critical social, emotional, behavioral skills so that we can build our friendships and feel successful doing it. Today, we're diving into why do we feel so awkward? And when we feel really awkward about being a friend, how are we going to teach our kids how to be good friends? We dive into both sides of the ADHD coin. Sometimes we're like, I don't know what to say. Or sometimes you're like, I definitely said too much. We answer your questions about what do we do when people ghost us? Or how do we talk to friends about having ADHD? Or how do we reconnect if we haven't talked to somebody in a while? We feel like maybe we ghosted them. Caroline also gives some really great advice on how do we address these tough behaviors with our kids when we see they're going down in flames and we want to help them, but they also do not want to hear anything that we have to say. How can we have those tough conversations without hurting their feelings, but also still helping them be kind friends and learn these skills that we need to function, not just as kids, but as adults in our relationships across the board, in families, friendships, work relationships. Having these skills of friendship and building relationships are key to so many pieces of our lives. So let's welcome Caroline Maguire to the show. How's it going this morning?
I'm having a fabulous day because I'm spending my day in areas of a high interest, which fuels our brain. So fabulous.
Sweet. Okay. Well, can you just give us the mini version of your diagnosis story, when you found out and kind of how you worked through knowing that, given whatever age you were along the way, so we can just get that perspective of where you're coming from on this whole ADHD journey.
So I was diagnosed at age 12. My learning disabilities had not been remediated. And when I was diagnosed, they told my parents, she's dyslexic. It's really late in the game. Get on this. But they told them that since I was a girl, I would outgrow the ADHD. So my parents very dutifully and at tremendous expense and sacrifice did get me help for my learning disabilities, but they didn't get me help for my ADHD. And my mother waited patiently, thinking that I would outgrow this. And then in the late 90s, Dr. Ned Hollowell's book, Driven to Distraction, came out, and my mother went to see him speak. And she would start I don't want to use the word pester, but she would say, I'm not sure. I think that you're so disorganized, etc. But it really wasn't until I was 25 that I really found out. I was in a ballroom. I worked for a company that was launching a drug called Concerta. And I was in marketing, and I was hearing all of the education and the speakers. And I was like, oh, I do that. That's me. And I ran upstairs and I called my mom and I said, don't I have that ADHD thing? And she said, yes, you do. So some of my journey really began when I was 25 and I started getting help and I started seeking resources. And, yes, we knew, but really, if physicians tell you not to pay attention to something, you really don't. And the only people I knew who had ADHD, so this is early 90s, right?
Yeah.
Were very hyperactive. And so I didn't think it applied to me. But I will say, for anyone out there, I always say there's sort of pre-finding out Caroline and post. And I am incredibly different because I have found those compensatory strategies for my ADHD and because I work with my brain. And so when I say I'm having a high interest day, like that's important to me. And I don't do certain things that are low interest to me. I farm them out.
I'm like, oh, do I want to go down that rabbit hole right now?
You don't have to.
I know. It's so hard. When I'm doing interviews, I'm like, that is not the topic today, Patricia, but I could have a conversation about that. So let me back up. I was diagnosed when I was a freshman in college, so I was 18. And quite often people will say like, oh, I wish I had known, especially with, most women now are getting diagnosed in their 30s and 40s. And they'll say, oh, if only I had known, 20 years ago. And I'm like, well, yes and no. It's like, yes, I knew, but like there just wasn't the resources. Like I got diagnosed in 2000. So it's like there really wasn't the resources available then. So it's like I knew, but it's nothing compared to what we know now. And I'm like, oh, well, yeah, even though I knew 2000, Patricia really could have used some of these strategies and tools that we didn't have back then. So I always like to tell moms like, yes. And also it was just different, 20, 30 years ago and how they were saying, oh, don't worry, you'll grow out of it.
I mean, I think the distinction is when I started being an ADHD coach 15, 16 years ago, so 2005, I'm probably not wrong on my math, I had a whole thing on my website. What is ADHD? What is ADHD coaching? I don't have that now. I don't have to explain to people that there's this thing called coaching and that it's really effective and it's the gold standard and that it's part of the treatment protocol. I'm sure that in certain areas, certain countries, I would still have that, but I think that's a huge difference. I used to rehearse a spiel to explain to people what this was. I don't really have to do that anymore. People still are desperate for coaching and for resources. Do not get me wrong. We do not have enough. Mm-hmm. But they're like, oh, I've heard of that thing. I need it.
Yeah, very much so. When you look at having ADHD as a mom, what do you think are some of the areas that you really excel in because of your ADHD?
I think because of my ADHD and because of my background, I am really good at let's talk about how you feel and let's explore your strengths and what you're about. I'm good at that talking piece of parenting. I'm good at that. Like my son came home from camp yesterday and he didn't want to wear the camp t-shirt. And I'm really good at the why not? How come? Well, how do you feel about that camp t-shirt? And I'm also open to the idea that there are people in the world who don't get you and that sometimes we have to let it go. And I think that's a major thing when you're raising a neurodivergent kid, that they, a lot of parents try to talk you into liking people or talk you into, oh, I'm sure the teacher isn't saying that. That's super prejudiced. I am really good at I guess that probably is how they feel. How do we cope with this?
Yeah. I think when you have dealt with it, your little red flags go off.
Mm-hmm.
And you sit there and you're like, oh, well, that is possible. Because most people will be like, oh, well, grown up would never say that. And you're like, yeah, but that is possible. So that the empathy and the intuition to be like, okay, well, what if that did happen? How would we deal with that? Is a really important skill for not only for us to have, but our kids to watch and know that it's okay to question.
And I think I'm naturally, because of my ADHD, a creative thinker. I had a boss who used to say, I see the forest through the trees, instead of the real phrase. And I think I'm not a parent who says, oh, that's not boring. I'm like, wow. Like my daughter's reading this article on fracking. And it was like the most boring thing you've ever read. And like fracking and that whole thing for science is actually like really interesting, but they had made it really boring.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the parent who says, no, really, this is interesting. I was like, oh my God, this is dull as ditch water. Why have they taken this super interesting topic and made it this way? What do we do to get you through this? You know, I'm not the person who pretends stuff has value. I'm like, okay, we got to do it. What do we do? And I think that comes from that ADHD lens and that experience that I've had as a person, you know, who like could barely stay awake in our history class. Not that if you love our history, I'm not like for it, but for me, I could barely stay awake. I could not focus. I couldn't think. And so I guess I know that, you know, and as kids come to you, I'm not like, oh, it's super interesting.
And I think it's also okay to say, like, this concept is really cool. This method we're doing it in could be better. Again, now I'm totally off topic here. But when you think about when we hear other people be like, oh, no, it's really interesting. I think that's what lends us to this lens of not trusting our intuition and not trusting the little notes inside of us that are telling us like, wow, this is a really boring article. When other people are like, oh, no, it's great. You just, you know, look at this. It's so cool. And we're just going to go do it. It's like trying to convince you otherwise. Like I know as parents, a lot of times we're thinking like we're trying to help our kids get through this hard thing. But instead, we're telling our kids, like, your perception of this is incorrect. This is actually a very interesting topic. And I feel like that's like part of the roots of where we start to lose our connection with ourselves.
Yeah, I think that parents have a fear picture. And I think the reason I'm successful with parents is that I validate that fear picture. And the fear picture I understand because I am Irish, I'm from Boston. My grandfather would have said, you got to tough it out. You got to make things happen. You got to work hard. So I understand the fear picture of there are things you have to do in life. There just are. And I think I validate that fear picture in parents like, oh my gosh, my kid is not going to be able to do anything. They have to be able to tough things out. But what I try to do is to say to them, if we acknowledge the interest, and if we understand that interest is our fuel, and interest is what allows us to focus, and interest is so paramount to us, we are not saying you don't have to file your taxes, right? We are saying we have to do it in our own unique way. And I'm validating for you that you as a parent are afraid that, you know, this kid is never going to do the things they need to do in life. And I'm telling you that there's a secret way forward. And the secret way forward is to use creative brain-based solutions. So I think that's part of it. And then I think as a parent myself and as an ADHDer, I'm always thinking like, what is it that I would have wanted someone to give me, you know, instead of just saying, suck it up, use willpower, because willpower is a finite resource. I can give you willpower for this, but then it's gone for something else.
Mm-hmm. I think that fear is what drives so many of our parenting decisions. And it's valid. I mean, we want our kids to do well. We want them to be successful. We want to know that they're okay. You know, we default to these things. Like you said, my grandparents were the same thing. Tough it out. Everything's fine. They're also, you know, Irish and Eastern European types. And like, you just keep on going. And when those are the only tools in our toolbox we have, we use them. And when we meet people like you who are like, okay, I got some more tools for you, then we can recognize our fear and say, yes, this is true. I am worried about my kid. I want them to be happy. I want them to have friends. And what we've been doing isn't working. So what are some other tools we can gather? And that can feel so like there's so much relief in that as a parent to know that you can still keep your kids safe and help them be a great person. And that there are tools out there available that will make sense for the job that you're doing.
Right. And there's almost a contrast in this that like, there's a level of trust where I'm asking you to trust me that I can do things as a person with ADHD. I need you to trust me that I will get it done. I will just get it done my own way versus the way that maybe traditional people have been doing it. And that's kind of my whole shtick with the social skills. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to get ADHD people to be social in a neurotypical way. We tried that for hundreds of years, right? And I'm not trying to ask them to mask or pretend that we don't have these traits or pretend that we're going to be 100% either. Let me just lay it down. No one stops monologuing and never monologues again, right? we get up tomorrow and we try to do it differently. But what we can do is use our own unique gifts to be social and to learn social skills and to be out there making friends. It will look different, and the way we get there will be different. There's a leap of faith in that, and we have to understand our brain and understand that we are different.
Yeah. I think a lot of the struggle, especially for moms who are listening to us today who also have ADHD, it's like, I want to help my kids make friends. And yet I am also very awkward and don't know how to make friends. So where do we start when we want to teach things that we are not good at ourselves? What do we do? Please tell me, help. I'm an introvert. Please help.
So first of all, I love this question because this is a question I get a lot. And I'm actually working on my next book, and this is like a sidebar, right? Like this is something we have to address. First off, we are social models. And so I think it is important for us to first acknowledge that. And I also think our own friendship struggles, without being inappropriate, obviously, can be something we talk about with our kids. We can take the journey with them to some extent. And I think some of the most powerful conversations I've ever witnessed have been where a parent says to their kid in my office, I have always struggled and I would have done better in my career, better in my life. There was no path forward. No one told me how to do things differently. I didn't know how. And I don't want you to have those struggles. I don't think you have to suddenly show up as a different version of yourself. I think you can model this act of saying, this is what it meant for me, and this is where I struggle. And you can start to embrace trying to make some efforts and trying to embrace change. That doesn't mean you become some different person who's ultra social if you're an introvert or you're an inattentive or it means you're saying we're all trying to work on something.
Yeah, when I look at, like, for context, my husband is neurotypical and extremely extroverted. My youngest is a carbon copy of his extrovertedness. Either one of them can talk to a wall. They will strike up a conversation anywhere, and it's so easy for them. And then my oldest has more of my social skills, where I worry about, like, oh, am I bothering them? I don't know what to tell them. Like, I'm the kind of person who's like, I'm at a restaurant and I only have a fork and I need a spoon. And I'm like, ooh, I don't want to bother them because I gotta ask for the spoon. And the same thing, my oldest will be like, you ask him for a spoon. I'm like, you ask him for a spoon. And there's my 5-year-old going, can we have a spoon? And I mean, like, it's quite hilarious. So in those places where we want to speak up and we're not sure what to say or where to start, what are some of the first things we can do to start creating change there? Start with me, very selfish of me. When we're just like, I don't know how to talk to people. What do I do? Where do we start?
Okay. So I love this question too, because I think it's something that we all as parents struggle with, whatever the skill is, right? Like, where do I start? So here's one of the things I heard that I love. We all have bias. There's like 79 biases or something. We all have bias and we all have default programming. And I think one of the things that you start with is to know your default programming, which is for you that you don't necessarily speak up when you need a spoon. For me, it's that I'm too polite. I'm too polite. I'm not bold enough. I sometimes don't self-advocate enough in a totally different way, but I know that about myself. And I think that's like a really big first step. I think the second step is using some of the stuff in Why Will No One Play With Me and using some of the stuff I have on my website, CarolineMaguireAuthor.com. I have tons of free stuff. I have scripts. I love having a script of, like, in this situation, here's the 3 questions I can ask. In this situation, here's the stuff I can tell myself. I'm not bothering them. I deserve to have a spoon. I should have been given a spoon to begin with. Like, whatever it is, to sort of say, when I don't have a spoon, I'm going to get up and I'm going to say, hey, I need a spoon. When I'm chatting with someone and I feel awkward and I'm not sure what to say, I'm going to ask them, how was your day? Right? I'm going to say to them, what are you doing for the summer? Whatever it is that you need, so that in those scenarios, which kind of recur again and again and again, you're going to have steps that you take, because that's what you're really looking for, is like, what do I do in this scenario?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you have that knowledge of your default mode, which is I sit here without a spoon, or I don't talk to the person next to me, or I don't say hi to someone. And this is something I provide all over is like, what are the first steps that I take? That's what I'm all about is like, what do you do first, second, third? Because if you have that, then you can go do it in theory.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of times with ADHD, we get so caught up in our head or we feel so overwhelmed by the situation that the vague advice is like, well, just ask them a question. And you're like, but what do I ask them?
Right.
And so we don't have a tangible thing to do. And it feels like for us, when we don't have a clear picture of what that looks like, vague instructions are just as terrible as having no instructions. I don't know what to do. So if we've got 3 things that we can pull from, even if you only remember one of them, you have like this sturdy thing to grab onto of like, okay, I know that for the next 2 months, I can ask anybody like, how is fill in the blank season that you're in? How is your summer? How's your back to school? How are your holidays? Like that is an easy go-to question of how is the fill in the blank seasonal thing going on? And that for me feels way more sturdy than people are like, well, just talk to them. I'm like, but what do I say?
Well, and I think what you're bringing up is comes to one of my number one hacks, which is to have a job or an excuse to talk to someone. So if you are, the bartender at the barbecue, if you are running the grill, if you are in a church group, if you are a kid and you work the yearbook, you have a reason to talk to people. That's an excuse and a role that's clearly defined, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel or figure out why you're talking to people. You're given an already made excuse. And the other thing that you're bringing up for me is that, yes, the vague advice doesn't help us. It's why I exist. Because I used to, when I was working at the Hollowell Center, I wanted to help people beyond just academic skills. I was running all these social skills groups, and I would read and read and read, and all the advice was so vague, and it drove me bonkers because I was like, this is too vague. And I tried using the advice with people, and they would say exactly what you're saying. They would be like, but what do I ask? What do I do first? I was just working with a college student on this who's at a summer program where she was like, okay, I know 3 different groups of people. When I arrive, I get what you're saying. I go and I talk to those 3 groups of people. How long do I stay? What do I say when I get there? We need that advice. Otherwise, it's exactly what you're saying. And people are like, what do I do?
Now I want to flip that on the other side.
Before we continue on, I want to say thank you to our sponsors whose support allows me to bring you this podcast for free. As moms, we're always on the lookout for a quiet fidget to help you and your kids feel peaceful when life feels uncomfortable. Calm strips are the way to go. These are thick, durable, reusable stickers with texture that you can fiddle with without any unwanted attention. And the stickers don't leave behind any residue. They are great for kids at school because you can stick them on the desk, a binder, a notebook, and they can touch, scratch, or trace the textured surface to regulate restless energy, increase focus, and remind themselves to breathe. My personal favorites are my moon keychain and the ones that have ridges, but they have several different textures to choose from, along with lots of fun shapes, creative designs, and even affirmations. Calm Strips was started by people who know what it's like to live with anxiety and ADHD, and they are actively working to destigmatize mental health. Head over to calmstrips.com and use the code Motherhood20 for 20% off orders $20 or more. And thank you for supporting Calm Strips, and thank you to Calm Strips for supporting us.
For me, I'm like, I don't know what to say. And a lot of people with ADHD are like, there's that moment where they realize they have said too much and now it is awkward and they don't know what to do then. What are some examples of what we do? Like when we realize like, whoa, overshared, too much, alert, alert. What do we do then?
So one of my biggest pieces of advice around the oversharing, because when you're nervous, you need something to cling to. You can't remember everything. So I do entire courses on how to stop oversharing, but this is my biggest thing. Who are you talking to, right? And what do they need to know? We have different levels of intimacy and trust with different people. What happens is we with ADHD forget. And so I barely know you, but I share my life story, my social security number, every relationship I've ever had, my financial history, right? We all fall into this. But when I'm talking to someone, I'm not always present enough to think, oh gosh, I'm doing this. So part of this, and this applies for the advice I just gave you too, is to have a mission and to be working on one thing. So you're working on asking for the spoon, saying something. People who share too much information, yeah, there may be a myriad other things that are going on. I wouldn't try working on everything at once. I would work on, when I'm talking to someone, thinking, who are they? What's my relationship with them? In other words, what's my level of intimacy? Do I know them? Do I know their last name? If you don't know their last name, don't date it. You don't want to share that stuff. And then trying to think as you talk, what do they need to know? Like, why am I sharing this information with them? And I have many, many other steps to this, but I think like to be present and to be thinking about that is like a huge leap forward. And that could take you months and months and months to work on. And it's very hard for us. We have to sort of work on one thing at a time sometimes, because otherwise we feel so bombarded.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the things that I was like my biggest aha moments from when you were talking at the ADHD conference last year, is you had and of course, now I don't remember exactly what the visual looked like, but I can like see in my head, I was like, oh, like this person is like, I barely know them. So like, this is the kind of relationship I should have with them. This is the like acquaintance versus friend versus like best friend. And you had this chart that explained like this different levels and like what kind of information goes with them. And I was like, oh, this is so helpful to see very clearly, because we generally do much better with visual representations when we have ADHD, is having some kind of like analogy or like physical thing to attach to it so we can kind of save it in our brain. So it's like being able to see like, oh, these people on the friendship stack, the different levels, it's like, this is the kind of information they would get. And that clarity of like, when you see like this person you barely know and like all of my relationship trauma, it was like, clearly they don't go together. But to be able to see it in that picture was like, this is where like the disconnect comes, is that we share this information, or we expect to have this like really intimate conversation with somebody who, like, you would give the example of like, you know, the person you see at the coffee shop.
Right.
Even if you see them, like, even understand the difference between like that person you saw one time at the coffee shop versus the barista you talk to every time you go, even they were two different levels of people. And I was like, oh, this makes so much more sense now.
Well, and I've been doing a lot of work with Jessica McCabe, because I've been helping her write the friendship chapter of her book. And one of the things we came up with is like, we do this thing as ADHDers too, where I meet someone, I click with them, I like them, right? So what do? We want to instantly be their best friend, because I don't really like small talk. I don't really want to talk about the weather. I don't really want to build a friendship. I want you to be my bestie now, right? But we have to step back, because what we also do is we assign them like friend status. We say, I'm meeting a friend for coffee. No, you're meeting someone you just met for coffee. That helps us remember what we should share and not share. It also helps us to feel less bad. So let's say that person cancels on us. Now we feel terrible. No, someone you just met canceled on you. They weren't really a friend. They didn't really let you down, right?
Right.
But all those nuances are really important for us. And I think we also have to remember that neurotypicals are thinking that we build stuff, that we build a friendship, that we build those levels of intimacy and trust. So if we jump right to, I'm going to tell you my social security number, the neurotypical is like, whoa, right? And so we have to remember that because we love to be closer, that's our go-to in our brain. Like, I do it. I mean, I'm totally guilty of this, by the way. I'm totally guilty of meeting someone and thinking, oh my gosh, we really clicked. And then thinking, oh, the friend canceled on me. And I think it's a distinction that's really important, because our kids do it too. And so when your kid says to you, someone disappointed them, and they tell you all this stuff, one of the important things to do is to ask for clarity. How well do you know them? How much time do you spend with them? Not to belittle or demean their experience. They're upset and they're allowed to be, but also to help them reframe, because they're also doing it. We're doing it as adults and they're doing it as kids.
When you were talking about that, I was like, ooh, I think this has to do with like our struggle in prioritization of like, we don't see that level of intimacy with the different kinds of friendships. To us, it's just friend all lumped together.
Mhm.
But a lot of times we would use the friend for the person I saw one time at the coffee shop that I said, I'd see you there tomorrow at 10. And that same friend label we applied to the person we've known since third grade. So that's hard for us to see the different layers unless we've stepped back and gone, okay, well, how well do I know this person? Well, all I have is their phone number and I don't know their last name. So
And I also think it goes back to the emotional stuff that we feel. We feel things so intensely. And I think sometimes we're looking for people to give us information and help that they may not be ready to give us. And so I think it's the prioritization. I think it's the executive function. I think it's that we feel things so strongly. I almost feel like it's like a rom-com, where the girl or the boy feels like I just met the person I'm going to marry. Sometimes with friends, I feel like I just met someone who I really click with, and I don't click with everybody. So this is really good potential, and I get so excited. But I don't know that neurotypicals feel the same way. And so they may not feel like I just met the one, right? We may be right. We may have just met someone who really zings with us. But we have to remember that they don't necessarily see things the same way, and that they are going to be scared off when we start telling them about our history of childhood trauma, on the first meeting. It's super hard. I don't want anyone to think like, oh, Caroline was saying this is all easy to modulate. It's not. There's a lot of self-talk that goes into it.
I'm like, oh, before I jump on the self-talk, one of the things that I also was thinking about when you were talking about that is a lot of times, because people with ADHD dive headfirst into a friendship, when you then meet another person with ADHD that dives headfirst into the relationship, that sometimes we think that oh, this is how it's supposed to be. So sometimes we get that positive feedback that we can dive headfirst, and all of a sudden, we're riding on the bus and had a whole childhood trauma conversation with the person next to us of clearly we are connected and soulmate friends. Because both of us have ADHD and dove right in, but that's not how most people function. So it's you got this positive feedback that it worked in this one situation, but it doesn't work in most of them. And I wonder if that's confusing for us as well.
Oh yeah, right. So it's absolutely that scenario has happened to me, happened to my clients, happened to people who write me emails, and we get that positive feedback. The other thing that happens to us though is, it was so great talking to that person on the bus, and we got this sudden feedback and whatever, except they may not be good for you. And we don't always think I get to choose, right? So I'm not really good with all these dating apps and all these friendship apps as much because of my dyslexia. I tend to say swipe right or swipe left, and I'm wrong. But we tend to think oh, yay, someone picked me. They swiped me. I'll just use that instead of left and right, so my kids will hear it and be like, you said the wrong way. But we get so excited, pick me, without giving ourselves the credit or feeling the confidence to know I may have zinged with that person on the bus and we may have had a great conversation, but it turns out they're kind of toxic and they are not necessarily good for me. And I get to choose people who are good for me, and I get to have friends who love me as much as I should be loved. So when I was doing research for that presentation and others, one of the things I found that I think is really important to say is that when we overshare, especially in the teenage years, we make ourselves vulnerable, because now that person has a bunch of information about us that they shouldn't necessarily have because we haven't built up trust with them. And so think about diabolical mean girls who could do stuff with that information. But it also means as an adult, I've given of myself and I don't necessarily know if that person deserves my trust or if they're going to be good to me. So it's something I care about because I want people with ADHD of all ages to know that we deserve to be treated well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That one really hit home of knowing that your level of vulnerability matches the level of trust that you have with that person. And that's how you know you're safe.
Right.
Safer. I mean, obviously it's never 100%, but safer with that person when you have that level of trust with them.
And I think to know something that we don't know, either because our parents are ADHD and they didn't model it for us, which is trust is earned. And we deserve to see that that person earns our trust. So the reason I care about working on oversharing isn't just because we're embarrassed and we get a self-regulation hangover and we feel bad and all of that. It is, but it's also because I deserve to have you earn my trust. And for me to say, let me see what you do with this little bit of information before I share a lot of information. And it's not easy. Please, everyone listening, know, I know that that's why I have it laid out in a multi-step process on my website. It's not easy.
Well, I think that goes right into one of the questions that one of the moms in my Facebook group asked. Liz says, how do we cope when people ghost us?
Yeah. So first I want to normalize something that I think is like unnormal and sad. I read some stats that most of us will be ghosted in our life. So I want to say that because a lot of times I think we think it's me and it's only me and I'm the only person who has been. That's not true. It's a growing trend. And I think there are various reasons for it, but just know that. I have this in a blog laid out more cogently, but what I would say is if someone ghosts you and you've written to them and asked hey, can we talk about what happened? Or why the relationship has fallen apart, I would let them go in peace. And I would start to do the grieving work to let go of that relationship. Do I like ghosting? Not at all. I think it's incredibly wimpy. I work with teenagers every day to say that's not how we're going to handle this. We're going to have a real conversation, But I know it happens a lot. And I think what we as ADDers tend to do is we write 49 texts trying to explain what we did, what we said, our position, and it doesn't change anything. It just adds to our negative feelings. If someone seems to be ghosting you, I also wouldn't jump to assuming that it's ghosting. I know I don't always text people back, right? So I would start with a very generic, hey, haven't heard from you, right? Would love to connect and see what they do with it. That's the other thing. I find with people with ADHD, we have a very scarcity mindset sometimes. So we go someone is I've been away the past 2 weeks. So I have a ton of texts I haven't returned and I have literally a list going. If you assumed that I didn't text you back and then you go into, I don't know what happened, Caroline, I don't know that is what we tend to do. I would try to stay away from that, right? Because that makes things worse. If you've asked them and they haven't responded, if you know because you had a conversation about it or they told you, I would try to start that grieving process.
Hey there, Mama. I've got something fun for you. Who doesn't love a quiz? I want to know, which mama animal are you? Because you're not your average mama bear. You have a magical ADHD brain that puts a sprinkle of brilliance on everything you do. Sure, you may have forgotten that laundry in the washer for the 3rd time, but what are your strengths? What makes your ADHD parenting style unique to you? How do you use that sparkle to bless your family? So which mama animal are you? Find out by taking the quiz, What's Your ADHD Mama Parenting Style? Because you're not your average mama bear. Head on over to patriciasung.com/quiz and find out. And then when you do, I want you to post your results on social media so we can see that you're #not your average mama bear. Along with the hashtag, I'm a mama, and then fill in the animal that you get. Again, that's patriciasung.com/quiz, and I can't wait to see what you get. So tag me at Motherhood in ADHD.
So on the flip side of that, Rumina asked, how do we reconnect with friends that we haven't spoken to for years? So she gives the example of between the pandemic and she's a new mom and she's on maternity leave. When there's been that big gap, how do we reconnect? And a lot of times we'll have that guilty feeling like we ghosted them because of whatever circumstances happened.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things I always say that I think we as ADDers benefit from is giving a little explanation of who we are to people. I know sometimes I don't text you back. I'm so sorry. Know that I adore you. I am terrible at communicating, whatever it is, just so people have that in their way. I had a professional contact where that's literally what they said to me. They're like, here's the person's information. Just know they're terrible at writing back. It's not you. It's not that you eventually won't meet. It's so helpful to give that context. So that's tip A. Tip B, interest to me is always the way to get back into people's lives, either by texting them something, I saw this and I thought of you. And, I am sorry I've been so terrible between pandemic, new baby, and whatever, I've been saying, or by joining something where that person will be. So you have that regular routine, you're going to see them going forward and being able to reconnect with them that way and reaching out to people and just being transparent. I've been terrible. I miss you. I've been thinking of you. I'd love to have coffee.
And that's funny because actually one of the other questions from the Facebook group was like, how do we bring up having ADHD to friends? How do you explain how you are and how you function to those people who are important, especially for people that have known you a long time? How can you explain those kind of things without it being a lot of hurt feelings?
And I'll give a couple ways, because back in a day, what we would do is talk about traits, because people didn't want to be out and they didn't want to say their ADHD diagnosis. So they would say to their boss, the way my brain works is this. I tend to be a person who needs deadlines, right? And I still think that if you don't want to use the word ADHD, that is a great way to go, is to talk about traits. I am a person whose attention drifts off. I am a person who forgets to text back. The way my brain works, I do so much better if we have a regular meeting set up, is to tell them those traits. And then for people who've known you a long time, I would tend to say, well, you remember how I work. This is what I've discovered. I work best when I do this, or I am best when I have it set up this way. And to sort of say what your brain does well and how you operate. And you can tell them the ADHD label or not, right? People are getting to be more educated. They're not educated, but they're a little more educated to know that there are certain traits we have. So if you say the ADHD label, if you're like, I have ADHD, I'm not great at texting back, people are starting to get it and to sort of know that's part of it.
And that's the same, like similar advice I give, like when people are asked, well, what do I do about work? I say the same thing. Like then you tell your boss, like, I really struggle with verbal instructions. So I'm going to send you an email after we talk to make sure I didn't forget anything. Or I take things to heart. So if something's not going well, can you let me know gently? Like, I want to fix it, but my feelings get hurt easily or something like that. Like, you can say things in a way that are not, I have rejection, sensitivity, dysphoria. Like, you can just say, I work better this way, or I do, things in this manner, so that you don't have to be out and about with it if you don't want to. So I think it just transfers well to all relationships.
Yeah. And I think it's great for us to do that as parents so that our kids can do it. So one of the greatest things I heard the other day was someone said, when you give me feedback, I am hearing it and I am processing it, but I need a few beats. So I'm often going to just understand and hear, and then I'm going to come back to you in another conversation to really process it and discuss it. And I thought that what I loved about that was it explained the brain, it explained our processing style. It also, one of the things that gets us in trouble is that people don't think we're hearing them and they don't feel validated. And, many, many times teachers will say to me, I really want to be there for so-and-so. But when I tell him or her X, they don't react. They don't say anything. They don't understand. They don't say, yeah, I need to do better with homework, whatever. And I'm like, well, they're a kid and they're probably overwhelmed and not processing. But just by saying and having that skill in life to say, hey, this is how I work. I'm hearing you, but I'm going to have to come back. I think it allows people to feel like, okay, they got what I'm saying, but you don't necessarily have to commit in that moment to going over anything. And I think for rejection sensitivity, that's a great way too, because I might not be able to talk about whatever right now.
Yeah. Like, that's funny. Actually, my husband and I had that conversation yesterday he was telling me things like, I had a rough day because I forgot to take my medicine, didn't realize it until I went to bed and saw it's my little pill box with the medicine still in there. I was like, oh, no wonder today was so hard. And he was like, I keep telling you things and you don't say anything. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that I was just absorbing it and processing it. And I wasn't actually saying anything back to him. So it looks like I'm ignoring him. So yes, of course he's irritated. But for me to know, oh, when he's saying these things, like I basically, like you said earlier, you need to have a catchphrase of like, earlier we talked about like, oh, how's your day? Or, what are you doing for your summer? In that place, I need to have a catchphrase of, oh, okay, I hear you and I need to think about it. Or like whatever you come up with. It doesn't have to be that. But like I need something to say in response so that he knows I heard him, but also I have time to think about it before I continue forward.
Yeah, I think that that's really important, especially because we all process information differently. And I think that there's an assumption in the world that like everyone processes the same. And sometimes I can't process what you're saying right now, or I can't remember it if you don't send me an email. And I think having like that little phrase that you have in your back pocket to just say, I'm hearing you, but I'm processing it. It makes people feel better. And it allows us the space we need. But yeah, and I'm the opposite. I start getting anxious about what you're saying. My husband's like trying to tell me and I like get anxious. And he's like, I'm just telling you, like in general, we need the HVAC in this house cleaned. And I'm like, okay, because I can't take it on this weekend.
Yeah. So like you said, having that base awareness of what your default is going to be allows you to choose the tools that are going to make sense for you in those situations. Like, ooh, man, I have so many more questions on here, but I'll do one more and then we'll wrap up. The last one I wanted to touch on is you were saying when our kids are struggling with something and we know that giving them this feedback is going to hurt their feelings. Like when you can see the reason that their friend is mad at them is because of they did blah, blah, blah. How do we talk to them in a way where we're not hurting their feelings and we are helping them and we're still getting that point across and like balancing that fine line of helping them be a better person, but also not crushing them at the same time?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So one of the skills that I'm going to be adding to my social spy tool for the next book is something called investigating. And I think being curious and coming from curiosity and investigating things is a really great skill for many things in life. And so with our kids, if I say, that person is not the right friend for you and they treat you like dirt. So like, this is really not a surprise, or you are too much for them. And therefore, yeah, you were talking over them, you were abrasive and they're reacting. We don't get through to them because not only are we crushing their soul, but think about anything anyone tells you in that manner. You don't tend to absorb it. You don't tend to hear it. So the biggest thing I would say that any scenario this applies is to be curious and investigative and to help the child witness. So you're never going to say you're abrasive and you drive friends away. What you're going to ask them is, what did the friend say? What happened before? What is it that goes on for you? And you're going to be very curious and tenuous, because it takes a number of conversations to help them witness what they do, right? And so this is short little conversation. This is not a big epic conversation. And in these short conversations, it's like, well, what's your style, right? How do you show up? How do other people show up? Think about this friend. What do they like? Right? Are they a person who likes people who are more bold, or are they a person who kind of retreats, right? Using those kind of objective things, it will help them eventually see their style and what they're doing, but it allows them to have the awakening. So this is the really annoying, tough part. I talk about this on Instagram a lot and I get a lot of feedback about it, but like I still stand firm on it. You have to allow them to come to the realization. If a friend tells them, that is like so wonderful, even if it's painful, because then they're getting the feedback and you can discuss the feedback. But you as a parent don't want to be the person who says to them, you're abrasive, because what happens is now there's distance between us. I don't want to trust you. I don't want to share with you. I don't want to be with you, right? And that parent-child relationship, that ability to talk about tough stuff is the most important thing you have, right? I want that more than I want them to have the realization. So everything is about like, what are the social norms here? What was going on here? What did you say? How did you say it? Right? Is a great way. Like, well, I said it like this, but I didn't mean it. Okay, but you did say it like that. There's also times, by the way, where no matter what you do, they don't see it. And here's my other hack. Coaches, teachers, uncles, aunts, friends who can have conversations with them and have those discussions so that you don't have it, right? Someone can go fishing with them and sit down and be like giving them that talk, and then it's coming from someone else and they're going to take it better.
No, that's really good advice. And I think we often want to solve the problem right now. So knowing that it is going to take multiple conversations over multiple days, possibly weeks, possibly months, to help them get to the point where they can see it. Like going in knowing this is not I'm going to solve this in the next, 45 minutes. This is something that takes time to allow them to get there. It's a very good reminder because we want to fix the problem for them right now.
It's so painful. Like, let me just validate everyone who's out there going, Caroline, I heard you say this on Instagram and I wanted to tell you I don't like this advice. I totally understand that. I'm telling you my experience for however many 18 years of doing this is that it's so much more powerful. Think of anything you witness yourself versus someone tells you, right? Why do I know that I'm a person who could run out of gas? Because I experienced it, right? And so I know when it hits a quarter of a tank, I'm like nutso about it. I'm like, get the gas, right?
Yeah.
So I want them to witness it because I want them to kind of start to know versus you tell them, maybe they even take steps, but they can't really have meaningful change because they don't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're mad at you.
On top of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like you go back to when they're 2 and you tell them like, don't do that, you're going to fall. You can say that till you're blue in the face, but until they actually fall, they're like, oh, probably shouldn't stand on that. Unfortunately, like that's it's one of the hardest parts about parenting is watching your kids fail or figure the problem out themselves when you know what the answer is. But that is like, being a human and learning how to human. So.
Well, and you are guiding them. You are a shepherd, right? You're taking them to the place where they learn that they fall. You're helping them. We're not just letting them learn on their own so that they're 45 when they finally realize that saying things in a super abrasive manner makes people not want to be friends with you, right? Let me just say that. But what we're also not doing is pouncing, right? So every parent out there, you can relate to this, right? And I have to hold myself back as a parent too. Your kid does something, or maybe they even admit to you, I'm too abrasive. And you're like, yes, you are. This is the problem. You do this all the time, right? We pounce, right. Like the door opens and we're like, roar. And it's because we're frustrated, we're afraid, we have all these things. What I'm saying to you is when the door opens and they say, so-and-so said that I never text back, and they're done because like they feel like I don't even care about them. Instead of pouncing and being like, see, I've told you, you have to communicate with people in life, blah, 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 right? Yeah. I'm saying step back and say, wow, that's really hard. Empathize. What was that like? And then let's do an analysis. What is this person telling you? And what are they feeling? And like, let's explore how we could help you be a little better about getting back to people, right? That feels very different than, yeah, I told you a million times, right? It's so different.
Yeah. No, I love that that analogy of the shepherd, like how they're just kind of like guiding the sheep along. And I said, where are you located?
I'm outside of Boston.
Oh, right. Okay. So I'm in Texas and I am not a Texan by birth. I moved here later, and they do all the rodeos. And there's a really funny event called the Calf Scramble, where basically they just let a bunch of calves loose. Say there's like 15 calves and there's like 45 kids. And the kids have to catch a calf and drag it into this chalk circle in the middle, and they win a scholarship for their FFA. And it is hilarious because if you've ever watched a 15-year-old try to drag a calf across the arena, like it's virtually impossible to drag this calf across. But yet, if you can just push him along in the right direction, but like even you can't push, it's like you're literally guiding. Because at any point you want to shove that animal, it's like, nope, staying right here. And that visual was like, this is what I'm doing with my kids, is that I can't push. Like it's a no contact sport. I can't push. I can't drag. It's just like the like gentle, like, what if we went a little more this way? Okay, let's go a little more to the left so that they can arrive there on their own. Man, parenting's hard.
Yeah, no, it's so hard. And it is kind of a goat rodeo, right? Like it's crazy and they're everywhere. but I want you to have that intimacy with them, because if you have that trust and they trust they can talk to you, they're going to talk to you more. And one of the totally developmentally appropriate characteristics of teenagers is that they share in little snippets, and they don't tend to come and tell you everything at once. And if they do, they're trusting you in that moment, and how you react really matters. And so, right? You can see very clearly you're wasting tons of time on TikTok. I can see you're doing this. But when they admit it to you, how you react matters, so that they'll admit other things in the future. And so that's why I'm like, don't pounce, because I want them to admit the next thing.
And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier about having that level of trust match the vulnerability, is that when they trust you, they will be more vulnerable. And if they come in with a little bit of vulnerability and you lose the trust, then you don't get more vulnerability. So like it goes in your relationship with them just as much as.
Yeah.
Well, that's full circle.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I love that. And the sort of, you have to match them a little bit in terms of their energy. And I always say, I guess some people don't remember being teenagers, don't remember being kids, but I have vivid memory of it. Like I've never lost that feeling. So if you can remember as parents, remember like when you would admit something to your parents and they would lecture you, how annoyed you were and how you were just like, yeah, I just told you I know. Right. And to this day, by the way, my parents lecture me about stuff and I'm like, I'm 48, so I'm kind of okay now. And I think whenever you remember that, it helps us to remember what it felt like and why then my deflector shield went up and I was just like, I'm not telling you anything anymore.
Okay. So for the moms who want more help with friendship, both for themselves and helping their kids, where can they find you? Where do they go?
Okay. So on Instagram and social media, it's author Caroline M. And if you just Google Why Will No One Play With Me, you'll get all of this, by the way. And then for my website, it's CarolineMaguireAuthor.com. I have tons of free stuff. My blogs are like books. They're really comprehensive and they're very step by step. I'm very like, here's 1, 2, 3, what you can do. Because like you said, sometimes you're like, what do I do if I want that spoon?
Yeah. And I also want to point out that you wrote a lot of books and a lot of blogs with dyslexia, which is like round of applause. And a great role model for kids who are struggling with that as well. Of like, this is possible. Like, this doesn't have to be a lifelong struggle in the way of like, I hate all reading and writing forever. There's hope.
Well, and I listen to a ton of things. I listen to books. I listen to podcasts. And I would also say I want to be transparent. And I tell kids this all the time. I always have a copy editor. I always have someone reading my stuff. I always have someone helping me with the organization. And I'm very transparent about that because I think we need to be. One of my cousins is the opposite of me. He is a graduate of Middlebury Breadloaf School. He's like a really good writer and he doesn't have dyslexia. And I was all feeling bad about that years ago. And I felt like a fraud. It was like imposter syndrome. And he said, I don't know a subject matter expert who can write as well as people who just write for a living. And he was like, I don't know why this is a thing for you, but you need to get over it. And it was really helpful for me. And so I'm really transparent to people that like, I just did an article for Attitude Magazine. I wrote it and then I had a copy editor help me and say like, this is not how this is spelled in any place, because I want people to realize that you can do these things and you may need some help and that's okay. That doesn't make you less than. It makes you needing that help.
Yeah. And that applies like being a mom too. You don't have to do all the things yourself. You can ask for help.
No. Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing I would say to moms with ADHD out there is that there's a lot of societal pressure and there's a lot of pressure where people comment on stuff. So here I'm going to out all my things. I don't cook, I reheat. I'm not a good cook and I'm not interested, so I'm not doing it. I had my groceries delivered long before the pandemic. I don't intend to go back. This UPS strike scares me terribly. All those things are based on my brain, my interest, and people do comment. People will say like, I can't believe you don't, whatever. And you get to a point where you just start to go, they don't understand.
Yeah. especially for people with ADHD, like how many wonderful things can you be doing that change the world that are better than the grocery store?
Yeah. And
What a
it's
waste.
one of those experiences that makes me like angry, grouchy, unhappy.
Me too.
It's like walking in the rain. Like I don't need to.
Okay, so as we wrap up, here's the lightning round questions. All you have to do is just fill in the blank. You don't have to explain anything. Number one, the best thing that I've read or listened to recently is?
The Body Keeps Score. It's a really old one, but it's really good.
That is a good book. Okay, number two, my most boring about me fact is?
I guess I'm an only child.
Number three, when I'm having a rough day, my go-to quote, song, poem, book, podcast, activity, whatever it is.
I watch movies about Winston Churchill and I lay in a chair or in bed and I want to quit or not do anything anymore. And then by the end, I'm like, oh, I have to be brave and I have to fight on the beach, fight in the streets, whatever. And I go and I do it. And I have a dog called Sherlock and I had a dog called Winston before. So I'm very into all this.
Okay, number four, don't tell anyone I
love shopping. I love shopping like Poshmark and stuff. It's like a total dopamine rush.
Number five, if I had a magic fairy wand for one spell, I would
make things easier for kids and I would give them friends.
And number six, my best piece of advice for mamas with ADHD is?
Do what you need to do and what is best for your family and think they know not what they say and they know not what they do so that you can ignore people.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. It's a really encouraging conversation for us to know that we can have these great relationships and it is possible to learn the skills so that we can feel confident when we're talking to new people and building those and creating that village that we need, especially as moms. And thank you.
Well, thank you. I can't do it alone. So I would ask everyone, like, come to my Instagram, author Caroline M, and tell me what you need. I will make it for you if you tell me what you need.
Awesome. Take you up on that. Thank you so much.
For more resources, classes, and community, head over to my website, motherhoodinadhd.com.